Muy bien, siendo las 15:05
Very
hora
good.
local.
So it's 3 o'clock and 5 minutes. So let me welcome you all to this first LACPASS workshop focused on IPS. I will just give you a brief introduction so that we can then hand it over to Sergio Peñafiel from the technical team Create from LACPASS. So I just want to remind you where we are and where we're heading. We are ending April, and the countries already have available within the context of the regional public good and the convergence with other interoperability and cross-border interoperability sessions. The first package of tools, as I was saying, has been made available. The Docker with all of the basic tools for what we want to carry out in this first component or this component of the project that has to do with international patient summary, which is part of the contents that we're going to be talking about in the workshop today. The idea is to continue talking with these workshops. This is the very first one, and they're all associated to the developments so that we can continue developing from LACPASS and we can carry out the implementations in the different participating countries. So this first session, although we do have some topics that have already been programmed and scheduled, although the final date need to be fully identified, we're thinking about maybe spacing them a little more because we also want to have an appropriate adoption and use, and that we have time for solving questions or doubts for each of the different topics that we address in the separate workshops. So let me remind you then that we are making everything available, and we're going to continue working in the workshops because the idea is to try to be well prepared for the second LACPASS Connectathon. That's one of the most important points here. We want to carry out a test, that test halfway down the year, which is extremely important. But let us not forget that all the enablers that are provided from the public good also have this spirit of trying to contribute to the region with tools that are based on international standards in order to promote health, cross-border interoperability, but also to contribute in the logics at the national level based on your own strategies, providing the basic enablers depending on the level of maturity that each of the countries in the region has. Let us remember that we have three defined tracks for the second LACPASS Connectathon. The first one is IPS, International Patient Summary, which is the most critical one. This is a part of the information that we have here, and it's the foundation, really. And these are going to be also the topics that we're going to be working in the different workshops. We have the vaccination certificate or immunization certificate, which, although is based on the DDCC structure, which originally came about in order to cover the COVID-associated cases, it'll now be extended to other vaccinations. And then lastly, we have another track which has to do with how we can sign these certificates and how we can provide solutions to those countries that do not have a local authorizing agencies, and how using this technology that is very well positioned, which is based on blockchain, basically, how we can then provide to the signature of these certificates. So the topics, the three big topics that we know that we want to address in these workshops that we're going to be carrying out are: first of all, the structure. We want all to understand the structure of IPS, not only in terms of what the standard defines, but also what it is that we are going to be using for our testing cases, checking the minimum data sets. And then we're going to continue working on transactions and the profile. defined to exchange the IPS. We first need to understand the structure, then exchange it and validating it, and then we can go on to the transformation and what other subproducts we can get from IPC and DDCC also. The dates that we have here are optional, or rather not definite. We will probably be displacing them a little bit because there are other topics, and this is going to be expanded. We need to include here terminological services. We need to include also DDCC related topics and also blockchain. And I'm not even considering everything that has to do with IHE and the pre-connectathon, where we will obviously have topics to address together with the IHE team regarding integration profiles, and of course, everything that's necessary in order to use Gazelle for the second connectathon. So that's my very brief introduction, and I will leave now the floor to Sergio Peñafiel, who is the technical lead of the CREATE team, which leads the LACPASS project. So Sergio, the floor is all yours. And let us not forget that this is being recorded in both languages and it will be available in the Raxel site. Okay, Sergio, the floor is yours. Okay, thank you, Carlos. Good afternoon, everybody. As Carlos was saying then, this is the first workshop which is focused on the Connectathon, the IPS Connectathon. And the topic for today is looking at the structure of IPS. So we're going to be working mostly on trying to understand the content that IPS has, and so that you can then later build them, which is the first step. The first step of the implementation and the test that we want to carry out for the Connectathon. So here I'm going to be switching from one presentation to another demo, then we're going to go and look at some documents. So it's going to be a little bit dynamic, this part of the presentation. But the idea is that by the end of this presentation, you're more acquainted with how an IPS is built, what are the sections inside of it, and what is contained in each, so that you can build your own in your clients or your information systems. So first of all, let me tell you that this is a presentation that is based on the official IPS guide from IHE. And there's going to be a link here. We're going to send you the presentation, and which is the official guide that IHE has published in order to understand the structure of the IPS documents. So let us begin then from the most basic information. IPS is the International Patient Summary, and it's a profile. It's a FHIR profile which was defined in order to exchange patient summaries between different entities. We're going to be doing it between countries, but it could be between different establishments and institutions in one country or other use cases. So there's no restriction in the sense that it's international, but it's a standard, it's a profile. And the IPS profile is made up of 4 parts. First, we have the header, which are here in blue. Then we have the required data. Then we have the recommended data and optionals. These are the 4 ones. And each one of these parts is made up of different modules. These are the blocks that you can actually see here. Within the header, we have 4 modules. We first have the subject, who is the patient, the main patient whose summary is deployed here, this whole clinical record or history. Then is the author. This is the professional, the practitioner who is issuing this summary. That is to say, the GP, or it could be a system actually. Then we have an important piece of information which could be empty, but it's called the attesta. That is to say, it's the patient's tutor or someone who represents the patient. We could have information there or not. And then custodian, and that is who cares for, who hosts the patient's information. All of that is the header, which is what all IPS have at the beginning. And they define that metadata for the document. Then is the required elements. Here we have three important components. We have the medication summary, which basically has active medication, previous medication, and different categories. Then we have allergies and intolerances, which the name basically speaks for itself. Any allergies or intolerances that the patient could have, any different types of reactions to this separate kind of substances. And then we have a problem list. This is a list of conditions or previous diagnosis, chronic diseases. It's all on that on that block. And then we have recommended and optional blocks and data. Within the recommended, the main one that we are going to be using is immunization, which is the first of all these four. Immunization has to do with vaccinations that the patient has received. And although it is recommended, we're going to treat it as required, which is necessary for the transformation to DDCC later and other formats too. So, and then there's additional information like history and procedures, diagnostic results, procedures that the patients have gone through, medical devices, which may be important. And then some optional data that are used less frequent and that are more difficult to extract, vital signs or functional status, etc. So as we have seen then, we're going to be working then with these. All of the header, because it's part of IPS and that's what's required to work. They're required, like the standard does require, they have to be there. And immunization. This is going to be the minimum data set that we're going to be working with on IPS. Now, obviously, if you want to include more information, you may do so. But at least for the connectathon and the tests that we're going to carry out, we are only going to be using this part of the IPS, of this profile. So now, to start on the technical side, what I wanted to show you is that this is the official site that we're going to be checking. That is to say, these are the IPS implementation guides which have been developed by HL7 Fire. This is the official site, and this is where the IPS official information is. The same diagram that I have just explained, and the same explanations also regarding the profile, what it's for, and how it's used. This is a Fire implementation guide. If you've never seen one of these before, it always follows the same structure. Here we have an introduction, then we have the table of contents where you can see the different elements that are part of this guide. And the idea is obviously that you read this in the order that it's written in, and there are more detailed technical explanation, but also on how to use the profile and how those elements that you select in particular. Within the menu that we have here at the top, we also have artifacts, IPS artifacts. So here you can start looking at more technical information. For example, you're going to find this site where the resources that IPS uses are defined. And at the bottom, you can also see the attributes that these resources have, the cardinality, that is to say whether they are optional or required, or they could have more than one, what they mean and what type they are. So here you can see one in particular, composition. And in subject, it's a reference to a patient. And patient is another profile that has all of this data. And then you can start technically adding all of this data. So let us go. We're going to look at this in detail, but I just wanted to mention that you can find that here where it says fire artifacts, here at the top, where you have the IPS library. You have the list of all of the resources which are different to the normal standard because there are different fires like version R4 which have been changed. They have undergone changes and that have been slightly modified in order to go into the IPS profile. So here you can see the list of all of the resources that are used in the profile and which have certain changes. Like, for example, some things become required and some others not from the normal regular fire profiles. So that's the implementation guide, and this is the official document. What's there is what you have to be compliant with. So in order to begin, what we have here is the repository, the IPS national backend that you have all received, and that's the one that we're managing and working on. Within what we have provided, there is a file which is called examples. And there we have two IPS files. They are both IPS that come from other activities. These are examples. These are not real patients. So here we have the IPS JSON. You can see here, this is basically this is an IPS. This JSON file, which in general are very long, as you can see. So the idea of this presentation is then understanding how this IPS JSON works. So to start looking at it, the first thing that we're going to do is to copy the file, and I have placed it in a JSON online editor. You can use any tool that you want in order to have a more simple visualization of the JSON. So let us work with this editor, and we're going to be switching them between the presentation and the editor to look at the different parts that this IPS has. The first thing that you need to know is that the root attributes of this JSON are the ones that are here. It's simply 5, and they are, this is a fire bundle. You can see a resource type. All of the fire resources have this attribute called resource type, which says which kind of resource it is. In this case, it's a bundle. Then we have an identifier, and the identifier has two parts to it. One, which is the system, and the other one is the value. The value is the identifier itself, and system is what system this identifier comes from. It could be the national registration, the passport number, etc., or it could be self-generated. Then we have type. In this case, it's a document. And these are fixed values, bundle, document. Then we have the timestamp, that is the date on which in which the document was created. And then we have entry. This is a list of all of the information that follows. The important thing to learn here is that an IPS is a fire bundle, which is what we have here also in the presentation. So if you go then to this link that is in the presentation, we go back to the official documentation, to the IPS implementation guide, and you can see that we're looking at the resource called bundle IPS. And as you can see right here, has the exact same things that I showed you in the JSON: an identifier, a type, which has to be a fixed value document, the timestamp, which is when the bundle was created, the same thing that I have just told you. It's here. And then it has a list of entries, and we're going to be looking what that is all about. But this is the way that this implementation guide can be read, and you can verify that through examples that you may have. So that's the root of the IPS. All IPSs will have this part. And then all the information itself, that comes in the entry, which is what we're going to be looking into right away. So here in this presentation, I've done the exact same thing: an identifier, a type, which is document, the timestamp, and the resource type, and a list of entries. That's the bundle. And in general, the bundles follow the same structure in FHIR. Then the first entry in the bundle, I mean, there's the entry list that I just told you about, and the first one has always got to be a specific type called composition. And composition is another profile, as you can see here. It's a composition IPS. And composition has certain information regarding the header and also general information on how the whole IPS document is assembled. So here you have this resource has the information of attester and custodian, which were two of the parts of the header, you may recall. Out of the four modules, there were two, one called attester and the other one custodian. So that is part of the composition. And it has a definition of all of the sections that come thereafter in the document. So it says there is a patient, there's the professional, then allergies, then diagnosis. It's like the guide in order to continue reading the document downwards. It also has other data that could be considered metadata: dates, headers, authors, confidentiality, and others. In our example, if we go back here and we open up the entry, we're going to see the first one. This is a file that has 105 entries because it's quite a thorough, complete IPS. It has all of the modules, if I'm not mistaken. But if we open up the first one, we can see that it's resource type composition, just as the standard requires. And within this resource, we have several pieces of information. For example, here we have the date and the title. Here we have another type. It's also a fixed value, which is the patient summary document. It's the patient summary. Then we have this other part, which is the subject, which is the reference to a patient which will be defined as another entry later on. Then the author, which is also a reference that should be defined further on. And it has this other part, which are the sections to come. So if I open this up, this tells me this is an IPS composition that brings information on allergies and intolerances, also on medications, conditions or problems, immunization, procedures. Each of this is one of the modules in the IPS. And there here in the composition, I declare, so as to speak, everything that's coming afterwards. That is to say, it's like a summary of the whole document. Within each one of these, there's also there's also certain coding. That is to say, aside from the fact that this allergy exists, it also gives you the most important information. For example, the code and the text. And this is the reference to what comes later on. So these references, for you to understand, is the same from the patient here, will always be resource type, the name of the resource, and then an identifier. And then later on in the document, as a separate entry, we'll see that this patient exists with that identifier. So this patient comes with 5 entries of allergies and intolerances. It also has 5 entries for medication, 3 for conditions, and with several regarding immunization. So that is the part of composition, going back to the beginning then. The first entry then of an IPS resource is this one, the resource type composition, which brings information of the whole document and the whole sequence, the bundle in general. It has, in general, it has patient as a reference that will be defined later on, also has a data like the type, which is always the patient summary document, and then the sections, which are the same sections from the IPS and the reference to each of those sections that will be defined further ahead. So that's what you're always going to come across on the first part for the IPS entries and composition. And if you go to the documents, you can see that it's the same thing that I was just showing you. Composition then can have an identifier, a type. In this case, it's just what I was saying. This code, which means that it's a patient summary document, the subject, which is a reference to a patient, just like we saw right now. It could also additionally have information like encounter, that is to say, the consultation, the episode, the doctor's appointment in which this IPS was created. It could also have information on the attester, the custodian, which is also optional. It's usually an organization, as you can see here. In the case that we saw, I believe that there was no custodian. And then it comes we have sections. And each section, well, we have all of the sections that the IPS could have, which are the same sections that we saw in the chart that I showed you just now. And each of these sections have code and the entries, which are the references to what's coming ahead. So the composition, as I was saying, is how the document is assembled, the way that it's composed, the way that it's made up. And it gives us this general overview of the IPS. So that's the first part that you're always going to find within the entries. Then we have the patient. Now, generally, although the standard does not define a specific order, normally the second entry in the IPS, it's patient. So here we saw the first one, and then the second one is patient. So the patient is a file resource also, corresponds to the subject on the IPS header, and has the following field. It has more, but these are the main ones. An identifier, or maybe more than one identifier. It has the patient's name, date of birth, a gender, telephone number, these kind of information. We can actually look at the implementation guide, and you can see here the same thing that I have just shown you. It also has information like, for example, address, which are optional. And that's the definition of a patient. So if we go to the example here, again, we can see it's a patient. Here we have the name. This is the name of the patient, which is also separated by giving name and family name. In the case that we require that, we have the patient identifier, as I was saying. You can manage several identifiers. So we could have this required, but you could have more than one. So here, for example, we have a local identifier, and then we could have other identifiers like passport or social insurance. In the case that we are managing for IPS, we are going to be requesting that the IPS that you request has at least two identifiers. One is the national identifying number that you may manage for patients, but the other one is the patient's passport number, so that they can be searched with two different ways. So the identifier, just like we saw at the beginning, has a system, a value,
Escrito de esa forma. En este caso, el
which
paciente
are described there. In this case, well, the patient, the date of birth, telephone number, email address, also has, well, the address. And you can see that address is also a resource, and you can check it, which has all of these fields. That is to say, everything is well structured. Nothing here, I mean, it's just a free JSON. These are all parts that are defined within the standard. Very well done. So generally, as I was saying, this is the second resource then is patient. Patient or then has the information of the subject, and this ID is the one that was referenced in the composition further up. Remember that it had a subject, patient, slash, and then a number. Well, this is the number where it has all the patient's information then. So, and that's the next thing that you're going to find in all of the IPS, which is obviously a required data. That is to say, the patient's data. What comes next is the professional's data, the information from the practitioner. It's called practitioner, precisely. Here you can again see the information that it has. It has name and contact information. And it also has, this is basically what it has. Now the order could vary a little bit. Usually the one that comes next is, here we have a device, but the one that usually comes next is, normally, the one that follows, or one of the one that follows, is a practitioner then. So here we have the name. In this particular case, this is the only information that's really required according to this specification. So that's another one of the parts that you're going to find then, and it's then the author. So far, we have seen the 4 modules for the IPS header. And the author is here in practitioner, which is part of the entries. The subject is in the patient, and the attester and custodian are normally within composition. So then, if you remember the chart, the 2 required ones now come. And the first one is the medication summary. Medication summary is also defined in the standard. But in this particular case, unlike the rest, which is one type in particular, here it could have several types. It could simply be medication. It could be medication statement, medication request, medication administration, or medication dispense, which are all of the types in FHIR that treat or that deal with medication. Now, obviously, as the names say, they refer to different things. For example, one is medication that the patient is currently taking. The other ones are prescriptions, and the other ones are medication administration and medication dispense, which require more specifications. But what we normally find is medication statement and some medication request. That would be the most general or common thing in the IPS. But the standard does require or does allow for all 4 of these. From here on, all of the resources will follow a structure which is pretty standard. And that is that they will have at least a title, coding, and a description. And within coding, we have the coding system, which is normally SNOMED, and the code associated in that coding system. So at least you're going to have this data or maybe some additional ones. So if we go to medication, which is this one here, you're going to find what I have just explained. And then aside from this, you could also have active principles or ingredients and mechanisms, the different mechanisms which you can also find here in the resource. So if we go here, This is in no particular order, so I have to start looking for it. Here, there's a medication statement there. So this is a medication statement. And as I was saying, it has additional data like the dosage. Here it says that it's an oral, and also the reference to the medication. Well, and the subject who is the patient that we're checking here. So in this example, then we have a medication statement and other entries too. You could have more medication statements with other pieces of data. This is another medication, obviously for the same subject. And here we have it could be the same one or could be a different one, oral use in this case. And here we have another one. So the other ones are just one because it's only one patient, only one practitioner. But from here on, you could have several entries, and for each one of them, you could have information for one specific medication, for the next, and for the other. So this is one of the required data. Then we have the diagnosis or active problems or conditions. These are condition document type. Here we have different options, just as in medication, but actually here it's only going to be condition. Again, you can check here. You can see the implementation guide. And again, the conditions, unlike documents, have a different data, like severity, for example, the category. In some cases, it could even include the body where that condition applies to. And they are defined then as entries in the IPS. So if we go to the one that we were looking at just now, this one here, this is a condition. So in this condition, we find data like this one, the clinical status. It says that it's an active condition. Here we have the coding, SNOMED with that code in SNOMED, and this is the description. In this case, it's hypertension. So basically, this entry is telling me that this patient has hypertension, and that is the condition. And you can also see that it follows the same structure. That we have the resource. It has the coding system that it's a SNOMED. Normally, it should be SNOMED, and also the SNOMED code that corresponds to this condition, hypertension, and the subject who is the same subject as mentioned before. So here we have a condition, and we could have more than one condition here for this entry. Again, we have here the condition, we can look at it, and this is another condition, congestive heart failure in this particular case. And in this particular case, there's other data because there are some optional pieces of data here. Also, since when the diagnosis comes from, that's part of the information that comes here in active conditions for this patient. And then the last of the required data that we're going to be working with is allergies and intolerances, which again are also entries for this bundle. And they are one type only allergy intolerance. We can take a look at this implementation. Again, we can see here here we have information like, for example, the criticality of the allergy or the intolerance. and if there's any particular reaction, which can also be specified by looking at the severity of this reaction with the code that's always present. So if we look at the example that we have here, we can see an allergy intolerance, an entry here, which is well, the resource type allergy intolerance. And we can see here that first we have the coding, which always comes first. In this case, it's allergy to pollen and corresponds to SNOMED and that code. This is the name associated to that code, pollen, allergy to pollen. And here we can see that this says that it's active, and it's also confirmed. This is another piece of information that can be added here. And also we have here the reactions. So here we have this as a reaction which is also coded, like the way that these situation manifests itself given this allergy. And again here then, this is how the information for allergies is structured. All of this entry then is one allergy intolerance, which is the last of the required blocks for the IPS. So going back again to the summary, an IPS is like this. It's a bundle where we have an identifier, type, timestamp, and then entry. The first one is always composition, which gives us general information, and it also gives us the section. This patient is going to have allergy conditions and medication, which is what we saw also. The first one's always going to be the patient, and then the one that follows is going to be a practitioner. Here, patient data, like the name, gender, date of birth, and then the ones that follow will be the ones that I have declared here at the top. Like, for example, these profile allergies, problem list, and medication. So here, that is what I should find. Allergy, the same ones that I have just described before. Allergies, then we have conditions, and so on and so forth. The last one, as you can see, it's medication. So that's the way that the IPS is assembled, and all of the modules that come are alike. For example, immunization, which is the other one that we're interested in including so that we can later make the transformation to DDCC, has the same kind of implementation. So here on the guide, this is condition again, I apologize, but we can look for it. Immunization, here it is. So again, here we have a vaccination code, site or the protocol applied. This is the additional elements for this immunization part. So this will also be defined as an entry in the bundle. You will find that in the composition at the top, and then at the bottom in the entries further down. Not only will it have the extra information, but also the coding with the coding system, which is normally SNOMED, as we have said countless times, and then the extra vaccination information. So the one that we were checking just now does not have this, or actually it does, but I would have to look for it. But I think that the idea is pretty clear. I think that you already understand that the IPS documents follows this structure. And that's the way then that you can see the IPS JSON. You can check it and you can review it. And then the last thing that I wanted to say is that the Docker compose from the national backend also has this application, which is a viewer and validator. This is the public version in this server, but every time you run it, you're going to have this application, this web application, where you can see on the one hand a IPS JSON, just like we saw right now, and you can see it here. Again, we have the bundle, the first entry, which is composition. We can look at the different sections. You can click on them and deploy them all. And on the right-hand side, you can have a view of that IPS, but in a more friendly way, where you can see the header, the patient information, and then the different sections as separated blocks. So allergies, it's the allergy intolerance that we saw in the JSON, and we have all of these. This is one, each one of these is a separate entry, which has this definition, this code, and also the data that we add, like for example, the criticality, which is one of the pieces of information that the allergies could have. Also with active problems, each one of them, these is an entry here in the JSON where we can have this definition, this code, and unlike the others, this could be another like CD10. And in this case, we have the date when the problem was diagnosed. Here we have a past problems. That's the difference between the one at the top and the one at the bottom. It's the same resource, only one is active and the other one is the past diagnosis when we look at the clinical status. And here we also have then the name, the code, and the date. And you can also check that because they are different entries in the JSON on the left. The same thing with the medication and immunizations. And additionally, this viewer has observations that several IPS bring, which is basically, well, the rest of the information. These are the categories that we're going to manage for the test: allergies, diagnosis, medications, and immunization. But the rest, if you want to take a look at them, they are in this table here at the bottom. You're going to find the category and then the rest of the data, the description, the code, the date, and any additional specific value that they may have. So this is the viewer that we have shared with you together with the Docker Compose. So when you are building this IPS, you should use this tool in order to test it out, because this tool is a viewer and a validator at the same time. You can paste your IPS here that your client or that your information system is providing, and then this tool will validate, will tell you that it's okay, or what it's missing, or where you have a problem. And if it's good, you can actually visualize it. So the recommendation to move forward is to use this tool, to follow the specifications from the implementation guide, and the IPS elements as we have mentioned. Mostly the entry list with all of the information that we have just reviewed. And that's how IPS are assembled. And as I was saying then, this is initially based on the official IHE guide with the IPS structure that we're also going to be sharing with you, which has the exact same information that I have just shared with you, composition, and you can check that here also. So the last minutes, maybe if you have any questions or doubts. I would like to give you a piece of homework, creating an IPS as an example with data that you can use from one of your systems, or at least type in. The homework is basically creating the IPS, the structure via Slack to start sharing that with the technical team. So we can check them and we can carry out the validations. You can use the viewers, and the idea is that we are all comfortable that we are creating the structure correctly for what's coming, because then we have transactions and everything else. Are there any questions in particular with what has been shared or what has been shared by Sergio? Everything's very clear, apparently. Well, Slack channel is always there if you have any issues or any doubts when implementing it. Well, we are about to finish. So that's the homework. Next Friday, we're going to be doing the VJ. You're talking about the validator? It would be great to post this to a server. It would be good to have the validator available in Raxel. Euclides, your hand is up. We can hear you loud and clear. I have a doubt. In here, in Colombia, there is a law that has to do with the confidentiality of people and their information. And since we have to share a patient's information here, I don't know what impact or how that is considered regarding the different local legislations. That is a big topic. I'm going to answer part of it, and then Fernando will probably tell us regarding other implementations that have taken place. From the regional public good point of view, we're working on the test environment. It's always a proof of concept. So for the exercises that we're carrying out, simply showing how technically these activities can be carried out, there's no major complexity. The data is basically tested data, not real data. Now, once we finish all of the technical work in the region and we want to move forward locally, that is to say, in each of the countries that want to truly implement this in production and to start implementing the standards in the local realities, obviously, we have to look at the standards and the obstacles, because technology is always one step ahead of the regulation. In some countries are a little more stringent than others, but still, but IPS is a summary, and there's information there that is not shared, but still that needs to be checked locally. Fernando, maybe you can help us with some comments given your experience in international implementations. Fernando, where are you? There you are, Fernando. We cannot hear you, Fernando. Your mic is open, but we cannot hear you. Well, apparently Fernando has some connection issues. We couldn't hear him. But Euclides, it is part of the pathway that we do need to address. It's part of the things that we need to look into. And we know it's part of the things that need to be done. And this has got to be in agreement with the legislation and the regulation, what can be shared, because in the IPS, there's data that is sensitive. And there are some other aspects also there we get related to data security and how this data is encrypted, how we can make sure that both the issuer and the receiver are valid. That's all part of some of the things that the regulation requires. So yes, there are frameworks that allow for exchanging information as long as these security basic standards are complied with, which the interoperability profiles define. Although we're not going to be testing some basic security aspects defined by IHE, they are available in the tool. And obviously, once we have people interested in implementing these
toda esa parte.
in production, we can reinforce that together with everything and anything else regarding regulations, which are all different in different parts of the world. And although we're part of the same region, there are some that are more lenient and some others that are a lot more stringent.
En resumen, que al menos para
yes, then it is an important point for what we're working with here. I mean, we can continue working because it's not part of the scope. It's only proof of concept, but it is one big topic that we have to start addressing from Raxel. Raxel is also in charge of coordinating governments on these governance issues, and it's one topic that must be addressed, and obviously we will be providing that necessary support. Fernando, well, I don't know if Fernando's back, but it would have been good to hear what he had to share about some international experiences, but he's not here apparently. No, we've lost him. That's all then. Any additional doubts or questions? Very well then. Well, no more hands up, so we can adjourn this session. Just remember, this has been recorded. It'll be in the YouTube channel, LACPASS. Also in the course repository, we're going to be setting up a new section because it's part of the convergence, but it's a new cycle. So we're going to create this new cycle where we're going to start uploading these new workshops. Probably next week we will not have a meeting. We will not have a workshop. We want to give you more emphasis to what's coming regarding transactions. So that you can structure within IPS, work on that. I mean, we want to give you some room, some space, so that we don't give you so much. And the workshops will be increasing their complexity level. When we start doing transactions, we're going to be doing some interesting things. So although this was a must to have this basic information, at least to have the first version of the bundle installed, for the next workshops, we are going to be connected. So that's going to be extremely important. It's going to be a lot more complex, but a lot more interesting too. So thank you so very much for attending to today's session, the first of many to come, and we will be coordinating the next meetings via the technical committee and via Slack. And if you have any additional questions later on, please make sure that you send them email or the other communicating channels that we have. Have a good afternoon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.